So you finished your semester, yes?
Yes, I did. I passed my test. Quite
Excellent.
luckily, yeah.
Congratulations.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
And you said you just joined a political party?
Yes, I did. I joined the left party. It's Die Linke called in German, and it's a left-wing socialist party, democratic socialist, and I would say ideologically it's similar to Bernie Sanders a little bit, even though I think most of the things Bernie wants to do are sort of already common in continental Europe because we already have a much more developed welfare state. But the left party is even to the left of what is the main, what Social Democrat Party, the SPD. And I joined them primarily because I felt that most of the more mainstream parties were very, very unconscionable on Israel Gaza. And so I'd thought about joining a political party for quite a while. But by I crossed all the other parties out because I felt that that was something which was just unconscionable to me. And yeah, I enjoy it, and it's interesting, and I think it's also very interesting seeing how political party works for the first time. And I think you get some interesting insights, definitely.
So what's the level of representation of your party in the German parliament?
I think that they got something like 8.9% of the what's called the Zweitstimmen. So in Germany, you have two votes in every election, but really only the second one is important. And basically, it's a proportional representation system. And the threshold is 5%. If you have 5% of the votes, you get seats in the Bundestag. If you go below five, you don't get any seats unless there are like some very special circumstances.
Mm.
And they're actually worried about falling below the 5% threshold, but they had a last minute surge in the last election. And I think that they were like 4.8% 1 month before the election. And then last minute, they surged to something like 8.9%. And now the polls, I think they're at 10.8 or something like that. And they're the fifth largest party in the parliament.
How does that compare to the historic levels of representation? Going back 10, 20 years, how has your party fared?
I think they were founded after the reunification, and actually the party started out with a lot of people who were part of what's called the SED, so the Communist Party in East Germany, and they formed a party called PDS. And so the party, I think they often were quite controversial because a lot of people who were members of the party had like a Stasi past. And the party was usually in the what's called the Neue Länder, so the east of Germany, which used to be the communist part, the GDR. It used to represent people in that part, and they heavily focused on that part. And so they became almost like a regional party. And I think they peaked at something like 10% at some point, and then they had a decline. And the decline occurred because they were becoming less and less popular in the east, and then they were replaced by what the AfD, so the right-wing populist party, was sort of similar to Trump, and they surged in the former GDR, so the east of Germany. And because of that, a lot of people thought that the left was sort of dying, but they did manage to then sort of gain foothold in the west of the country. And now they're back at like 8, 9, 10%. So they're back at the sort of peak where they were 15 years ago, and they're usually rising in the polls. And generally, they're on a little bit of an upward trend. And also, they have a lot of new members, which I'm one. Yeah, so I think things are going reasonably well.
That's really interesting how I think it would be easy to miss that important point that you just mentioned, which is it's not that these were lefty voters in the East who left the party and moved to a moderate party or a centrist party or a center left party. They went from the populist left to the populist right. It sounds
Yeah,
like that was the
yeah,
opportunity there for the
yeah,
AFD, and that's a lesson
exactly
for
what
us
happened. Yes.
or a reflection of what happens here. So now that you're a member of the party, how long before we see you on the list of candidates? Is that
I
a
think
potential future for you? Is that
I'm not sure. I think that's quite difficult. I think that actually going on like lists, especially if you want to get into the Bundestag, I think it's very, very difficult. You
yeah.
you need to do a lot of networking and stuff. So I'm not sure whether that's in the future, but I do think I want to keep engaged because I think it's very interesting. And I'm also just very generally interested in politics, and which is why I write the blog. And I think you just get some like really interesting insights, and you also kind of can travel the country quite easily. So there are a lot of like what's called Landtagswahlen, which is similar to like gubernatorial elections in the United States. And they oftentimes are looking for party members who will like help, who will knock on doors and stuff. So grassroots organizing. And that way you can travel the country. And I might actually do that this weekend, but I'm still not super sure because I also need to do uh, uh, I need to hand in like a paper for university, so I'm not. It's a
Yeah.
little bit iffy. But I see um how I'm going on with my paper, but I think I might go. We'll see.
Well, you're gonna have to let us know how that goes. School's important.
Yeah.
That's the
Yeah.
priority, folks. If you don't know my friend JP, this is Jan Philippe. He writes The Old Continent Substack. I'm Evan. I publish certain thoughts. Grateful to have everybody who's watching us live, and if you watch this in the future, thank you for tuning in. We are going to get to our
Mhm.
topic today, a new series from JP. He writes these long series. If you don't follow him, a lot of his stuff is real deep dive on European politics, transatlantic dynamics. Some series are 3, 4, 5 pieces long, and we're in the midst. Today, actually, this morning, he just dropped the second installment of a new series
Wonderful.
that examines sort of new class dynamics, emerging class dynamics, and how that affects our old and emerging political coalitions in the U.S., in Europe, and the U.S.-Europe relationships. So I want to get into that, but before we dive into that, before we dive into transatlantic class tectonics, I do want to ask you about the Munich Security Conference. That is something that political nerds here in the US and folks who are interested in foreign policy for the US have been paying attention to. And since you're not that far away, I was hoping you could let us know, what you've been seeing, what you've been hearing, what the kind of domestic. I know it's a European, it's a global, event and of global interest. But from where you sit in Germany, what's been your reaction to the conference, and what have been the major takeaways?
I think my reaction is that the United States is trying to assuage the concerns of the Europeans somewhat, but I find that to be concerning because I think that the the way that the Transatlantic Alliance has worked for the last like 7 years, I think that's almost certainly going to come to an end. I think that the relationship between the United States and most of the European countries is pretty broken because I think they don't have the same priorities anymore. The United States doesn't view European security as important as it used to be, and instead wants to engage in Asia. And I think that this is pretty you really can't fix it. It's so structural. I think that long term, Europe will just have to become a little bit more independent of the United States, make sure that it can defend itself better, make sure that it has more of an independent voice. And I think what I find concerning is that usually when Trump does something kind of ridiculous, the Europeans are beginning to distance themselves a little bit. But then what happens is that Trump takes back what he did just like a little bit. He does something and then he takes back like 8% of what he
Yeah.
did. And what happens then is that most European leaders are like, "Oh, thank God, we're gonna make this work again." And I think this dynamic is very dysfunctional because it leads to this short-term thinking where everybody kind of knows that the relationship doesn't work anymore and that you can't really bet your security on it anymore. But you're not really taking the steps to adjust to that because every time the United States does something which seems a little bit like it's addressing your concerns, the European leaders are basically just, oh, thank God, how wonderful. And this Munich Security Conference was that. Basically, Marco Rubio was there, and he didn't give this super aggressive speech like JD Vance did last year. And a lot of people were beginning to think like, okay, great, now the relationship works again. I think that's a pretty foolish belief.
Yeah, it's a you're I think God, that's so insightful. You're talking about a conditioning on short-term thinking, on a lowering of expectations. And we see this here in our own internal domestic politics as well, that what this administration does is they sink to a new low, either in terms of policy or in terms of executive branch action, or just in terms of rhetoric. And then there's maybe a little bit of pushback. And then a day later or a week later, there's a little bit of temperance to the position or the action or the statement, and then there is this sigh of relief. And that's not how governance is supposed
Yeah,
to work, and certainly not, the US Europe relationship. This is 20, 30, 50-year time frames, not
yeah,
20, 30, 50-minute time frames. And breaking everything down to this short-termism. I mean, I understand it. It's a very rational level of reaction. When the big dog is acting in a certain way, you kind of have to adjust, right, to accommodate that. But it's deeply concerning. So thank you for sharing that. Let's talk about your piece. This is it's novel. I think it's interesting. And it's also, I'm a pretty smart guy. And I got to tell you, I had to read it a couple times to like figure
Okay,
I'm
okay.
like, do I understand what this is? So break it down for me in plain terms. Let's start at the beginning. You say that the pre-existing environment, we'll say pre-Trump, the the sort of the status quo ante, uh, from Clinton to Bush to Obama, um, the class coalitions from the like top, the elite 0.001% to the 1% to the say the top 5%. And then there's the kind of the big middle class. There's the upper middle class, there's a medium middle class, there's a striving middle class, and then there's the sort of struggling working class, maybe the lower 50%. Tell me if I'm understanding this right. From about 1986, we'll say, to about 2016, those coalitions within the left and the right, and not even the left or right, but within the Democratic Republican Party, were more or less static. But when Trump comes around and changes everything in American politics, it starts to really jumble and reshake the way there's different stratifications within our economic class align with each other, against each other, and within each coalition.
Yeah, I think that prior to Trump, you basically had a kind of a gentleman's agreement between more educated people, but people who aren't like super rich. So somebody who went to law school and now works in a law firm, or somebody who went to business school now works at Goldman Sachs, or somebody who's a professor, a tenured professor. People who are above average, significantly above average, and who have a kind of ingrained status, but who aren't like billionaires. And basically, these people were kind of in an alliance, or at the very least, weren't too antagonistic with people who are actually like super rich. And the way I think you can look at this is really the time when you began to have this sort of gentleman's agreement is during the Clinton era, because Bill Clinton basically he said, okay, the Democratic Party, we can't just have this traditional working class constituency. We need to have higher income people. We need to have the educated. And the Clinton people, and also then people like Tony Blair in the United Kingdom, began quite aggressively courting these upper middle class professionals. And also, what they basically said is, okay, we will make, in addition to courting these people, we'll also make an alliance with big business. And that way, you will have an economy which works both for the very, very rich and which works for educated people. And you saw this with phenomena like globalization, tax cuts, also immigration to a certain degree. What you saw was entrepreneurs, people who founded businesses, especially the successful ones, were getting insanely rich, but also you had a really, really quite large class, not the majority, but a relatively large class of people who were educated and who were doing quite well. And the economy worked quite well for both of these people, or for both these types of people. And with Trump, you're beginning to see more of an antagonism. And specifically, what you're seeing is that super rich people are beginning to kind of turn on the educated, and there's beginning to be more of an antagonism. And one good example here is like AI. AI doesn't just affect blue collar workers, it also has a large effect on white collar workers. And so, what I think you're beginning to see is that two kind of groups of people who used to be sort of had a tacit agreement, they are beginning to become more antagonistic towards one another.
Do you think it's a fluid and organic feedback loop wherein the ultra rich, the super elite, the 0.001%, and the rest of the 1%, just the regular elite, the regular rich, see that see their interest as being increasingly oppositional, antagonistic, or is it more that the ultra or the oligarchs sitting behind Trump on the inaugural are are taking on the rest of the 1%, the rest of the billionaire class or the millionaire class, and the sort of the victims, the people who have been on the winning side of this are now on the losing side, are starting to see themselves and then react? In other words, is it coming from the top down and then there's a reaction from the ground, from the ground, from the from the ground up?
I know what you mean, yeah.
Or is it from the ground up and then there's a reaction to the top down? Or is it coming from both sides?
I think it's both. I think that people around Trump realized that basically the system, the way it's been working, wasn't sustainable. Because what they were realizing is that the United States is incredibly economically unequal and people are very angry. People are fed up. And Trump really understood this. He understood this basic thing that people are just angry. They hate the way things are going. They want something different. Even though he's sort of all over the place and he's this loud, brash person, he had the central insight and somebody like Hillary Clinton didn't. And I think what some people around Trump realize is, okay, we are rich and we don't want to sacrifice that status. We don't want to make any adjustments to how much money we have. So what we need to do is we need to find somebody else who can sort of take the anger. We need to find somebody who we can throw to the wolves or who we can show as like, okay, we are curtailing the status of the elites. And of course, what this class of people around Trump thinks, well, our status isn't getting curtailed, but their status is. And I think a good example here is like Peter Thiel, who was always very critical of the education system. And he was a very early backer of Trump. And I think he's sort of exemplary of this, of a billionaire who thinks, okay, I don't need to placate people who went to Harvard. I can just form an alliance with super rich people, tech oligarchs, and blue collar workers. And that's also how you have this like odd thing where Trump has been called a blue collar billionaire. And you think like that makes no sense. How can you be a blue collar billionaire? But it makes sense because the billionaires and the blue collar workers, in a sense, have a common enemy. They have a common class enemy in the educated. And I think the other thing is you also have, I think, economic shifts because the types of technology on which Silicon Valley is betting deeply affect the educated and not just blue collar workers or pink collar workers. And I think this economic shift in terms of the types of technology which are being promoted have also altered the class alliances.
Do you feel like this reshaping of the class alliances is complete? Do you feel like it's underway? And if it's not yet a complete process, what percentage of the way would you? I know you're not an economist, but from your view, is this a done deal and we're into new concrete economic alliances, or is it very much a process that is just underway?
I think it's underway because I think that the managerial classes and the educated, they haven't really come to this conclusion yet that this is what's happening. Because if you look at the Democrats, they're still trying to get billionaires on their side. And they're similar in a way to the Europeans, and that they're kind of real in that they're realizing that they're under attack and that they're being more aggressively hurt in their own interest than they were previously. But they don't really want to take on the people in power. They still are very cautious. And I think with Democrats, like when you listen to somebody like Hakeem Jeffries or Chuck Schumer, their idea is no, no, no. We're gonna sort of prostrate ourselves. We're gonna say, oh, sorry, we were too woke, we were too trans, we were too socially progressive, and also we attacked you guys too much. And the Biden administration antitrust stuff, that was a mistake. Please love us again. Please rejoin the alliance. And I think that the leadership of the Democrat Party really hasn't understood how much things have shifted. But I do think that there is sort of a shift in terms of people who have a certain level of socioeconomic status, but who aren't like intimately connected with democratic leadership. I think they're beginning to see people like Elon Musk and the entire class more as enemies than they used to.
It sounds like the change is happening. In other words, it sounds like the change is happening at the real life level, at the ground level on the street, in businesses and communities, and it hasn't yet been felt at the partisan leadership level of Democrats, which is, I think, true for a lot of things that we experience that strike us as common sense, where leadership from the party isn't even leading from behind. You think about that old Obama era term that Biden embodied in his decades within the party, where you sort of see where the party is and then lead from behind. We don't even have leaders leading from behind. They're trying to pull us to the right. I also I wonder about the way this is manifesting here. and the way you see it happening in Europe. What's similar and what's different?
I think the big difference is that Europe doesn't have the super rich class, which is as detached from the rest of society. So I think Europe obviously also has rich people, and also economic inequality has been rising for decades at this point. But I think in Europe you don't have this like super dominant oligarch class. You have very rich people, but they're not quite the same types of people as Elon Musk or Bill Gates. In the United States, you really have this idea of this tech entrepreneur, and he came up with this crazy idea, and he wrote code in his garage, and he changed the world, and now he's like this Promethean godlike figure. And I think in Europe, you usually have more people who have inherited their businesses or people who were managers themselves and just worked their way up. And you don't have this sort of like godlike entrepreneur figure. And I think the economic elites in Europe are much less sort of aggressive in terms of fighting the managerial elites. And I also think that in Europe, the managerial class has much more power compared with the super rich. So I think in Europe, as you look at an institution like the EU, that really is an institution which is completely geared towards managerial elites. There aren't very many entrepreneurs who work there. The influence which entrepreneurs do have isn't nearly as strong as the oligarchs in the United States. So I think Europe as a continent is much more geared towards the PMC. And I think this also creates this alienation between Europe and especially the American right, because for the American right, when they interact with people in Europe, when they interact with the European political class, they interact with people who they regard as their class enemy. And I think that's
Mhm.
something which really creates this sort of deep, abiding distaste which many on the American right have of Europe.
Ha- But that's new. That's part of your thesis is that that did not used to be the case. And this reshaping, this sort of divergence between economic coalitions on the left and the right here in the US and economic coalitions on the left and the right in the EU, that there's a divergence now that is leading to not just a change in platform and a change in actual governance, but at the personal level, at the interpersonal relationship level, from which a lot of actual state to state operations occur. There's an animus there, or a sense of interest being at such odds that's coming out that can't be brushed under the rug.
Yeah, I think it is. I think there is a personal animus. And I also think one of the things which is also noticeable is that in the United States, the political right really doesn't have this sort of centrist tendency. In the United States, the way it works is that you have centrists on the Democratic side, the Clintonites, who have this sort of technocratic triangulation approach, but the right has more of this sort of cowboy crusader spirit. And this has pretty much always been the case, even under Bush. And in Europe, you tend to have such a thing as a technocratic right. And so, not so much the populist right, but basically the parties which preceded the populist right on the political right. So, parties like the CDU, the Gaullists, the Tory party, they have a more technocratic tendency, which makes them more similar to actually the liberals in the United States. I think this also heightens this distaste because people in the political right in the United States, when they interact with the political right in Europe, they don't feel this sense of kinship. They don't feel like, oh, these people have the same sort of inclinations, values, and tastes that I do. And I think this also really heightens this sense of alienation.
So, in a sense, what you're saying, what's happened here is it used to be that, and we're generalizing, but if we're going to generalize and oversimplify, the 1% were more often than not supportive of the Republican coalition, donors to those campaigns, and the kind of the 99% were with the Democrats. And today, that's been reduced dramatically. So it's the point zero zero. Sorry, there's a cat here. So it's the 0.001%, and it's the 99.99. Again, generalizations. We're not exact in our figures, but it's a shrunken pool of economic elites, basically. But the part of the interesting thing here is that not all of those one percenters necessarily have come to realize that they're on the table, that they are being targeted by. And some of them might still think that it's in their interest, or they may not recognize or be in denial. Maybe they have good personal relationships with these folks, but they're actually being targeted by the ultra rich, the oligarchic class in a way that they didn't used to be, and they haven't yet come around to recognize that their interests are the same as ours.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think that this is especially true of sort of the leadership of the Democrat Party and the types of people who used to vote Democratic. And I think that they really haven't realized that their interests actually in this particular political setup do kind of align more with the working classes, or at the very least that they need to get parts of the working class back to support them, because you don't have this type of trust in the educated and in institutions which you used to have. So I think part of the reason why Bill Clinton's political strategy worked was because there was some sort of trust left, right? People still had this belief that, okay,
Mhm.
the political class sort of knows what it's doing, but that has eroded so much that you really can't do this type of politics anymore. Because fundamentally, something like triangulation relies on the belief that, okay, if the political elites agree, this must be a good thing. Because if you always position yourself in the political middle, it implies that the left and the right kind of know what they're doing, and so there's just no trust whatsoever. The entire strategy falls apart. I think the leadership of the Democrat Party, they really struggle with this, and they just want to continue this political model, which is completely outdated.
Well, we could spend all day talking about the failures of the Democratic Party, and I would love that, but I think we should dial in a little bit more on where you go with your argument, because I think it's really interesting, and it's not something that I can talk about with anybody. So we have the premise here about the changing, the sort of muddled, reshapen economic alliances within each coalition, and how there's kind of a difference of how much that's happened here in the U.S. and how much has happened in the EU. So now walk me through how that ultimately reshapes the U.S. and Europe dynamic, because that's something that we talk about a lot here, and something that I think everybody who's paying attention to politics and to foreign affairs is aware of on some level. But we don't often talk about the way these tectonics, these class tectonics, may be driving that. Connect the dots for me.
I think that the United States, it wants distinct things from Europe. It wants Europe to take care of its own defense more, because the United States, way they view it is we have limited military resources, and so we can't be engaged in East Asia, the Middle East, and Europe all at once. And so we have to focus on East Asia because we view China as the number one rival. We can't really ditch the Middle East because there are like political institutions sort of aligned with APEC who make that impossible from a domestic politics standpoint. So we have to deprioritize Europe, which means the Europeans have to invest more in their own defense. At the same time, they don't want the Europeans to say, okay, now we're taking care of our own defense. Now we'll make decisions independently of you. So what they need to do is they need to at the same time get Europeans to invest more. But then once the Europeans have invested more, they can't then say, okay, we're making decisions independently of you. We can defend ourselves. We're taking care of yourselves. Why should we listen to you? So I think that the way that the Trump administration imagines this is we support these nationalist forces. We support like the AfD, Reform UK, National Rally, Viktor Orban. And I think the hope is that they will basically collapse the EU or weaken the EU. And the idea, I think, then is that if Europe is sort of more broken up, that it's easier for the United States to sort of coerce individual countries.
Mm.
And also, I think the belief is just because these political parties are more aligned with us, because they sort of feel some kinship with the MAGA movement, with this type of nationalism, they are more likely to give us what we want. And I think that this is a kind of a flawed medium term calculation, because I'm not so sure that this necessarily works. Because what you're basically betting on is that people will invest in a political project of nationalism and
Mm.
then not demand the thing which is most important to nationalists, which is national sovereignty, right? So you're betting that, okay, we can ideologically support nationalism in one area, But then people aren't going to make a jump to say, wait, if national sovereignty is the most important thing and your nation being determining its own destiny, then why should we defer to the United States? So I think they have a kind of strategy for Europe, which I think will work in the medium term, but not. I'm less optimistic, or from my political perspective, pessimistic in the long run.
I think that's a really important point, right? I don't think this is is ultimately, I don't think this is a strategy that's going to serve American interests and American national security interests. And basically, what you're describing is 19th century imperialist
Yeah,
activity imposed on a 21st century populace. And part of the reason that brute power politics and imperialism and land theft and resource extraction and divide and conquer worked so well in the 1800s and the 1900s was because people, this was in large parts of the world, the pre-industrial era. People did not have access to information. They did not have access to autonomy. They did not have the ability to operate with a level of critical thinking in the way they were being propagandized and demonized and demoralized and dehumanized. And all that is different now. And so the idea that the U.S. is gonna run around breaking up countries and abusing those relationships and doing sort of state-based arbitrage to extract wealth and value um, is a lot less likely to be successful because people are a hell of a lot savvier now in those. Now, listen, let me just state clearly, all that being said, there is a common sense, innate human sensibility that you don't have to be able to read or write or have access to, right, the internet to sense when you are being taken advantage of,
yeah,
when right that's a level of intelligence that everybody has access to. So I don't want to pretend that it takes the ability to watch a Substack live or tune into
yeah,
Wikipedia or have running water pumping through your house to be able to resist empire. It doesn't, but the average global citizen it has a lot more tools and a lot more equipment today to resist that. Number one. Number two, this strategy is in the Epstein files. There's an
yeah,
email,
yeah,
right, between Peter Thiel and Epstein,
yeah,
and
and Steve
Epstein is
Bannon
just.
also. Yeah,
Oh, was it Bannon? I apologize.
I think it was the three of them. I think Thiel talked about two. Yeah, I think Epstein, Thiel, Bannon were the ones talking about. Yeah,
It's a lot easier to make money when things are falling apart. When things are breaking apart, there's a lot more opportunities to extract value, and that so you're right, I think. I don't even think it's gonna work in the short term, and I don't even think it's gonna work in the short term from the narrow perspective of American national interest. I do think I do think the strategy has a lot of upside from the perspective of business and elite economic interest. So if you're Trump, if you're in the oligarchy, if you're part of the corrupt Epstein class, whether you're a Democratic donor Reed Hoffman or a Republican donor like Peter Thiel, you do have a lot to gain from this break up Europe strategy.
yeah,
But our actual national interest is going to come at the expense of that.
yeah. And I also think that the other thing is just I think the United States doesn't anticipate sort of the way in which I think countries outside of the West operate a little bit differently, because I think that with the United States and Europe, it created specific relationships where the two sides of the alliance felt a strong kind of mental kinship. And if you look at the relationship during the Cold War, I think the single biggest factor which kept the alliance together was just both had a common enemy in the Soviet Union. Europe was worried about the Soviet Union because they were on the same continent. The United States was worried because the Soviet Union was their main superpower rival. And but also there's obviously this sort of cultural kinship, right? Both are Western societies. And also there was, I think, the sense of moral leadership, because a country like Germany obviously had just destroyed the entire continent. And so there was both a perception of a common threat, but also a sense that, okay, yes, we can't assert our own interests independently because we have lost a sort of moral justification to do so. And so we owe it to the rest of the continent and to society at large to sort of defer to the United States. But I think that's not the case when you look at societies in Asia. Even I think societies like, say, India, who have quite a strong incentive to align with the United States, or at least to balance against China, they don't have this intuitive deference which European countries have. And I think this is something which the United States isn't really prepared for. And I think if you look at Trump, I think he sort of, in a way, actually intellectually gets it. Because if you listen to Trump, he does kind of understand that the way in which the neocons and sort of people like Hillary Clinton have conducted foreign policy, he does get that that's not sustainable, but he hasn't, I think, internalized what that means in terms of how the United States has to conduct itself. So he says, okay, we're fighting too many wars. We don't want these forever wars. But then at the same time, he can accept that if you're going to fight less wars and if you're going to be less involved, that means that you you have a reduced capability to coerce people, right? And if you don't fight these wars everywhere, people are going to say, okay, I'm going to do something independently of you. And I don't think he has internalized that. So I think, does want there to be a little bit less military engagement, but he can't accept the fact that that would mean you can't coerce people. You have to treat people on a sort of basis of equality. And so it leads to sort of schizophrenic way where he both says we don't want forever wars, but also constantly keeps getting in situations which do kind of perpetuate these types of conflict. And I think it leads to this sort of schizophrenic mess which we are seeing right now.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to give the president too much credit of intentionality. We know that
Yeah.
the Heritage Foundation and Russell Vought, and I mean these are people with goals and ideologies, and Stephen Miller and Supreme Court, right? We know that there are people within the Trump coalition that have philosophies and theories of foreign policy. I don't know that Trump himself has any real long term vision. So a lot of it, I think you're right. There's a pretty intuitive understanding of what hasn't worked and what's not working,
Yeah.
what people don't like. Right? It's
Yeah.
not just
Yeah.
what hasn't worked, but what hasn't worked down to the degree that people can feel it and they don't want to support that. But I think you are also right to say that there's a lack of maybe a sophistication or I don't even know that it's he doesn't get it. I don't think he cares to get it. I don't think he necessarily cares to think
Yeah.
through, okay, what does that mean? And what does that mean for us again, 10, 20, 50 years down the line? That level of thinking just just unfortunately isn't really there. What do you make of the specifics of the Marco Rubio speech at this year's? And people have basically said that, last year's JD Vance performance at the Munich Security Conference was both remarkable in tone and in that it was brutal and aggressive and a departure. And it was remarkable in content. And that what people are, tell me if you disagree, but people have held up this year's speech from Secretary Rubio and said that it's, in terms of form, it's not as brute, it's not as aggressive, right? It's not as Trumpian in tone, but substantially, it is basically the same. And
Yeah. It is.
there's also some not so subtle Third Reichian language.
Yeah.
So yeah, so how does that strike you?
Yeah, I completely agree. I think that basically means we want to say the same thing, we want to make the same demands, but we do it a little bit more diplomatically. And the assumption is if we do it more diplomatically, we're going to get the Europeans back on our side. And yeah, they demand the same thing. They keep talking sort of civilization, like that's a term they often use, and they also talk about like mass immigration. And so what they're basically trying to do, I think, is they're trying to appeal to a specific kind of like national pride, which I think the European right, specifically the populist right, is likely to go for. They, I think, can sort of tell. I think what they think is if the European right gets into power, then they will focus primarily on like immigration because that's their sort of big thing which they're trying to ride into power. And by talking in this sort of civilization term, by talking about we beat the globalist elites together, and by talking about we need to reduce immigration, you're going to get these people to basically continue deferring to you in foreign policy out of a sense of sort of civilizational solidarity, I guess, because I think what they're trying to preach is this idea of we're the West and we need to save the West and we need to save our civilization. But because the United States is the most important country within the West, you need to defer to us. And I think, again, that's sort of inconsistent because thinking in terms of civilization and thinking in terms of nationalism are kind of inconsistent because if you are a nationalist, first and foremost, you care about your nation and you will look out for your nation's interests over other nations, even if those other nations are part of the same civilization, right? And if you look
Right.
at like 19th century European nationalism, they didn't defer to other European nations, right? A French nationalist would say, "Oh yes,
Y-
you see, I mean, the British Empire is the most important state within Western civilization, and out of civilization solidarity, we need to defer to them." And I think once again, it sort of shows that MAGA, they're kind of thinking that they can pick and choose, that they can basically say, okay, we have these elements of nationalism which we like, but then there are also these other implications which we don't like. And what they are thinking is that people won't make these connections and they won't do make these long-term implications in terms of what nationalism actually means. And I think that again, I do actually think that this will work over the time horizon of like 5, 6, 7 years. But I think beyond that time horizon, I think it's on shaky ground.
Yeah, I think that's a really savvy point because the loyalty is the glue that holds a lot of this together. And the kind of extreme Christian nationalism that we see here in the US holding this coalition together, there is a loyalty because there's nowhere else to go for these people. And if you're a European far right leader, that nationalism, that coalition of nations, that might serve you to team up with the US or other
Yeah.
countries or Israel or India or whomever, China. It might serve you temporarily. But
Yeah.
that alliance of nationalist interests is only gonna hold so long as it serves your interests. You know, one of the first things here in the US that we learn about the Second World War is that on one day we were the US and the USSR were teammates, and then the next day we were opponents. And
Yeah.
our national interests were aligned up until the moment they were diametrically
Yeah.
opposed. That loyalty, you can hold people in that nationalist coalition here in the US because there's nowhere else to go. But in Europe, there's if nationalism is the new game, extreme nationalism, then the next nation that's going to offer you a better deal, and a lot of nations have a lot to offer, that are competitive against the US, what we have to offer, that's a very shaky alliance. That's not something that's going to hold over the long term. He did explicitly mention not just civilization, but Christianity. I do just want to drop that. And the other thing I want to mention is, and this is a left wing problem as well, right? This is a bipartisan problem, but you're absolutely right to pinpoint on immigration. Immigration being this really activating issue, not just
Yeah.
in extreme nationalist movements here in the US, but abroad. And that what we have seen, not just from Trump, but from Obama and from Bush and from Clinton before him, is a form of globalist capitalism that makes makes migration and refugees more likely. And it's
Yeah.
not just attacking Venezuela, and it's not just supporting a policy in Israel and a policy in the Middle East that is deeply destabilizing. Right? It's not just our militarism; it's also our economic policy across administrations that that displaces people in a profoundly economic, and also you look at what the US is doing right now with Cuba and this attack on Cuba and Cuban sovereignty and Cuban quality of life and stability. It's about destabilizing, which we've done in our hemisphere for hundreds of years, and we do all over the world. That makes immigration inevitable, that makes refugees inevitable. And then we turn around and then we demagogue on the issue of immigration. So it is both creating this, and I don't think immigrants are a problem. I don't think right?
I
I
mean,
think
it's
it's good. Right. It's, it's a human right, but it creates a political problem and a political opportunity. And then we say, oh, this is a problem that we have to solve. The problem, the political problem, the demographic and the socioeconomic and sociological problem is unsolvable, and we're making it worse. And so we're just creating the conditions that make it easier for the extremists to mobilize and activate and demagogue and organize nationalist power that doesn't just hurt immigrants, but hurts all of us, of course.
Yeah, and I think also one thing is I do think that actually the immigration populism in the United States and in Europe is different because I think that the European nationalist parties I think are much more serious about actually curtailing immigration. I think if you look at Trump, most of his measures on immigration I think are essentially for show. I think it's basically I don't think Trump really has an intention to really cut off immigration into the United States. And I think this is for economic reasons because the United States, like pretty much every other developed society, has below replacement level fertility rate. So the native population would shrink. And I think that that's just not compatible with
I
developed
don't
economies.
I don't know. I think there is a real and active tension within the Trump coalition. I
I,
think there
I
are true Nazis like Stephen Miller who absolutely believe that the only people should be allowed into the
oh
United
yeah,
States are Afrikaner white Christians from South Africa. But I think you're right. There's also economists within the Trump coalition who understand that ending immigration is a crucial ingredient to destroying your own economy. So I think you're right to pinpoint that, but I think there is an ongoing active tension between people who have a lot of power and authority within this administration.
yeah, I agree. But I do tend to think I think Trump views people like Stephen Miller more as a tool than he himself is completely bought. And I think Trump has more of this sort of I think he has this like schoolyard bully instinct much more so than like being ideologically bought in. I think his what he does is he does these like immigration enforcement things which are like very brutal and which cause outrage. And I think his belief is basically by doing this, I can get this sort of anti-immigrant crowd riled up. And that way I don't really have to completely deliver on this. And so what I can do is I can just like brutalize somebody or even not just immigrants, but also like people who code as like liberal. I mean, if you look at the people who were killed in Minnesota, they weren't immigrants themselves. They were sort of residents, liberal residents who went to a demonstration. And I think Trump basically used this performative cruelty to kind of reconcile his base with the fact that the United States is likely going to remain an immigrant society, at least in terms of legal immigration. Maybe they will cut off immigration from Latin America, but I think in terms of like the immigrations in terms of things like H-1Bs or something, I don't think that's going to be significantly curtailed. But I
Yeah.
think in Europe, the people actually are serious about curtailing immigration to quite an extreme degree. I think that what they're oftentimes saying is they want to cut off mass immigration. So what their, I think, intention is basically is we won't let in like 100,000 people. We will maybe give out like 10,000 visas to people who are highly qualified. And I think that actually some of the European populists are quite serious about this. I think they actually want to like drastically curtail immigration. And I think this also has to do with the fact that Europe really isn't traditionally an immigrant society. If you look at the United States, it's been a multi-ethnic society for almost its entire existence, right? And I mean, obviously, the ethnic minorities were slaves at first, and also Native Americans who were driven off their land and genocided. But it has always been a multi-ethnic society in some way, even if there wasn't legal equality between the different ethnicities. But Europe has been quite ethnically cohesive for I think on like it really began to only change 50 years ago. So it's a decade. Europe being a multi-ethnic society is a multi-decade phenomenon rather than a multi-century phenomenon. And I think this means that it's much easier to actually have a kind of consistent ethnic nationalism to people in Europe. I don't think this will settle like consistently. I don't think long term this is what the European continent will embrace. But I do actually think that for a while, these types of like actual ethnic nationalists who have kind of thought ethnic nationalism through, at least to a certain degree, I think that that's actually a pretty strong tenet. And I think you even have some like really extreme people in Europe within the AFD actually who don't just want to cut off immigration, they want to do what they call remigration. And it's interesting, they don't even just mean people who are here illegally. Like what they talked about basically using certain laws to essentially strip people of their citizenship. And they had this idea that you could basically use certain kinds of anti-terrorist laws to like selectively strip people of their citizenships. And so they're essentially talking about having people who are here legally, who even have citizenship, and having them remigrated. And I think that that's much more present in Europe. And I think that the sort of American nativist sentiment, it's very loud, it's very brash, but I do think there is a kind of a liberal instinct in US society, which I don't think is there in especially sort of some parts of Europe. And I think Germany, unfortunately, is a country where I think this really nativist sentiment will fall on fertile ground, I fear.
Well, that's chilling. We see this here in the U.S. as well. The idea of uh, stripping people of their citizenship, stripping people of their rights, stripping people of their humanity, and this what I'm going to go on my soapbox and just say that some people like to pretend or tell themselves that Trump is some aberration, that he is different, that this is not the natural and logical and inevitable outcome of conservative ideology and conservatism. But if you look at the history, we need to understand that conservatives in the United States and the Republican Party has for decades been trying to make voting harder, trying to make it harder to have equal representation. That January 6th was not an outlier. January 6th was the logical inevitability of decades of conservative and Republican energy and efforts to take away the right to vote. Because in the same way that taking away citizenship and stripping people of their full rights and putting them into concentration camps in the US, whether you're native born or an immigrant, is also the logical and natural extension of a decades long project, conservative and Republican project of treating certain people like full human beings and treating others uh, as less than human beings. Jim Crow was not that long ago. Slavery was not that long before that. Women in the United States have only had full autonomy and the ability to open their own checking account and have full independence without having a father or a husband. No fault divorce in the United States is extremely recent. Taking away the right to an abortion and freedom and autonomy over your own body is a step backwards towards treating women and girls and children as property, which is what these people want. So using a new tool, right? Using executive action and legislation around terrorism and threats and national security interests to strip people of rights and put them in concentration camps and kill them is not a new thing. That's not a novel thing. Trump is no less. He's no less. I mean, this is Reaganism. It's Bushism. It's Goldwater. This is what the Republican Party has always been. So that's just. I'm going to get off my soapbox, but I don't want people to pretend this is something other than what it's always been. And the other thing is like this is so interesting to me how you make a really good point how the relationship between the immigration issue and immigration concerns in the U.S. is fundamentally different from how it is in Europe. And I think you really hit on a big point there that it need not even be conscious and cognizant to voters and to regular people here in the United States. I think there is something structural and something subliminal and subconscious about the way that immigrants are the United States, and people who aren't from here and whose heritage is not native here are what this country has always been. And so it makes it just a fundamentally different issue versus in Europe, where a lot of these nations were formed around ethnic identities that predate the nationalist movements.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that in Europe, actually, I think Europe actually hasn't had this like explicit racial classification for as long as the United States has had, because I think that's like the concept of race, I think, was primarily really relevant when the colonization of the Americas started. But it just on a like de facto level, rather than how it was defined, Europe has been more ethnically cohesive. And I think also the other thing with Trump is I I've always thought that Trump really wasn't a very ideological figure. I think that all of these things like this nationalism, the weird Nazi, Stephen Miller, I think for Trump, all of that is a means to an end. And the end is himself. I think that the main purpose of Trumpism is the self-aggrandizement of Trump rather than the ideological agenda. I think all of that is just a tool for Trump. And I think the reason why Trump attracts these like Nazi characters is because I think those are the people who are the most sycophantic towards him because those are the people who have nowhere else to go. And so I think the reason why you see these like bizarre Nazi figures around Trump is those are the people he like retreats to when sort of, you know, proper society is angry at him. Then he always retreats to like the most extremist people because those are the people who will crown to his ass no matter what. And I think that's a little bit different. I think in Europe, I think the political parties are more ideologically homogenous, and I think in the United States it's more sort of like monarchist. Like I think it's more like Trump views himself as an emperor, and he views ideology as a means to an end. I think other political parties of that ilk are a little bit more ideologically bought in. I think actually the most extreme example I think is the AfD. I think they are quite radical in terms of their ideology, and I think much more so than Trump himself
So this performative cruelty,
is.
it's about sending a message, and it is about kind of keeping people on side. And to go back to your original thesis, it's the wake up call, I think, for some of these people. It's understanding their economic fortunes. It's seeing how tariffs can affect their businesses. It's seeing how instability on the markets, put their families' futures at risk. It's seeing how their position, which from Republican to Democratic administrations until Trump, they could consistently rely on a sort of predictable upward trajectory. But now, just financially, economically, things are much more precarious, and that's one side of the equation. I think the other side of the equation is fear. It is fear. It's that this performative cruelty, these hate killings, right? I mean, the execution of Renee Good was a hate crime. It was a
Yeah,
hate crime against a lesbian white woman, and that
yeah,
is meant to terrify. But it doesn't just terrify the people that Stephen Miller views as Trump's political opponents. It also terrifies people within the Trump coalition. Some of these, what do you call it? The PMC, the
yeah. Well, I think PMC, like I didn't coin this term, somebody else called it. It's like professional managerial class.
right.
Uh,
Some of the people in the professional managerial class are not just seeing their 401ks and their IRAs, and they have to sell their third home or their second home, right? God forbid. But they're also seeing like, oh, my lesbian daughter or my trans grandchild who has no choice but to defend themselves is going to get murdered by this administration. It's becoming a little bit more personal safety and security and not just economic misfortune.
yeah, and I think actually like the most important swing constituency are these like sort of stupid young guys. This like podcast bro, dude bro constituency, and I
We'll say
think they
we'll say incurious
yeah,
young guys, not
curious, intellectually and curious. Yes, I think that, and I think these people really aren't very like ideologically bought in. I think that they just found the like way Democrats engage with politics and like the wokeness. I think they found this just sort of alienating. They were like, and Trump he seems sort of fun, and I think it really was kind of a, and I think also economic concerns played a huge role. I think that a lot of the like supporters who actually delivered Trump victory are also not very consistently Republican and are just kind of what we call low information voters, which is a slightly euphemistic term, I guess. And I do think that among them, I think Trump is losing quite a bit of support. I think probably the biggest factor here is just the economy. I think the major thing which he was elected on, according to polls, was cost of living crisis. I don't think he's really gotten a hold of that. I think
yeah.
also that he Trump, I think himself has become a little bit less important in Republican communications. And I think that the people who have replaced him, the
Yeah.
people who you might say are the future of the MAGA movement, I don't think they have Trump's juice. I don't think they have Trump's kind of intuitive sense. I think Trump, he has he has a kind of finger on the pulse tendency. I think he gets the way the wind is blowing. And I think the people who are likely to come after him, I don't think they have that quite as much. And I think they're a little bit more ideological, a little bit less politically potent. And I think that's actually also an advantage for people who are more
Oh yeah.
liberal in the US.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Trump is sui generis. There has
Yep.
never been and will never be another. Part of it is the era in which he grows up, and the role of the apprentice. I mean, even the apprentice, like, wouldn't emerge in this moment the way it did at the time
Yeah.
when people go back in the history and understand that there was a major writers' strike, and while there was a writer's strike going, you saw this explosion of reality TV, and that's the moment when, because you don't have to have writers, and that's the moment when The Apprentice comes about, right, and all this stuff. And so Trump possesses a great deal of genius. He's not
Yep.
just a creature of a moment in American history and American culture, but he does possess a great deal of certain types of genius that allows him to capitalize on opportunities in ways that others can't. And the successor is not going to be somebody who apes Trump or Trumpism in any way, as has always been the case. The successor, the next Republican leader, the next Republican champion, just as is true for the next Democratic leader, Democratic champion, are going to be somebody who breaks the mold and asserts their own single brand, their own singular identity, their own unique departure that essentially transcends and leaps forward beyond the party's brand affiliation. It has been said, and you have to forgive me because I don't remember who first articulated this theory, that we will never have another consecutive two-term president again. Now, you spoke about a lot of people who came into the Trump coalition in 2024 for the primary, maybe not exclusive, but the primary reason was economic anger, economic frustration, and that they saw the economy under Biden and did not want to vote for another term of that. And that Trump came back in part just because people were fed up with the status quo economically. So the theory is that because, barring some profound reforms and profound changes to the way that we govern and the way that we operate our economy and our finances here in the United States, that level of precarity, that sense of economic anger and insecurity is only going to grow from administration to administration. And as that tends to be the primary motivator for how a lot of swing voters go, that's going to make it nearly impossible for any president, no matter how popular. It's going to make it nearly impossible for them to sustain a second term in office and be reelected. My my suspicion is that Trump may be the first president of the 21st century to be elected to non-consecutive terms, but he won't be the last.
I I don't know. I don't know. I think in terms of non-consecutive terms, I think that in the United States system sort of prohibits that. I think, and it doesn't prohibit it, but I think it makes it unlikely because you have the term limit. And so I think usually when somebody loses re-election, I think the sentiment is like, get out, get somebody else in. I think that in terms of what will come after Trump, I think it's still up for grabs. I think on the Republican side, not so much, because I think whoever comes after Trump will in some way at least claim continuity with Trump. I think
Mm,
they might change a little bit, but I don't think you will have somebody become the Republican nominee in the next decades even who will explicitly repudiate Trump. I think you will get some version of this. I think you might adjust a little bit, but I think on the Democratic side, it's really up for grabs. I think it's really interesting because it could go multiple ways. I think we already did a video conference where I talked about like how I think Trump could increase the chances of actually there being a sort of leftist socialist
yeah.
challenger. And I
Mm,
think another possibility is that you get something kind of more explicitly elitist because the thing which the Democrats have been doing for the last 30 years is that they are quite elitist. Like they have a specific type of person who tends to lead the party, oftentimes well educated, kind of these striver types, but they don't claim to be elitist. So they always, you have a party which it works in a very elitist way. It's very tuned to the demands of big business, but it always claims like, no, we aren't, we're in for it for the little guy. And I think this is unsustainable because it just becomes alienating at some point. It's just it comes off so hypocritical that
Well,
people don't see it.
that's such an interesting theory. So what would that even look like? Because I think you're onto something, which is like people really hate inauthenticity and
Yeah.
they hate being lied to and they hate being told one thing and then experiencing the other. And to just say like, no, we are elites and we
Yeah.
are.
No,
What would that even look like? And I don't know that that would resonate with a lot of people, but I want to go with your theory and ask like, what kind of campaign slogan or what does that look like? Or is there somebody you have in mind?
I don't have any specific candidate in mind, but actually I wrote an article about this. And I actually kind of think I associate with this with like somebody like Richard Lindania, and he's not. I don't think he used to be Democrat. I think he was like a white supremacist for a while,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
he's really into like eugenics. But and
Mhm.
he started off as like a eugenicist, white supremacist, and then now he's becoming like more and more liberal, and it's very odd. And he always talks about like elite human capital, and basically his point is you have a bunch of people who are just smarter than everyone else, and they should be left alone. Like the proles and the blue collar people, they should just shut the fuck up and let the smart people, the coastal elites, do their thing. And I don't think it would be that explicit, but I strangely could see some version of that. That basically, instead of saying like, okay, we're these like educated elitist
Mm.
types, but we're for the little guy. You instead just say, no, no, no. We are these elites and we deserve to rule. And here's why we're better. And I get that this sounds sort of terrible, but I
Yeah,
genuinely think it
sounds
would be,
sort of terrible.
it sounds terrible, but I genuinely think it would work better politically than what we have right now. Because I think
I
there's nothing more alienating about this, like, about this just classism, this elitism, but always having it tinged with this like notion, no, 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 we're morally righteous. We're better than you. And I think that's just what made the Democrats for the past years just so odd. I think it's an either or. I think they could either go in the direction that they're basically saying, no, we're too tied to business. We need to uphold like the values of the little guy more, which I think would be like the Zora and socialism route. Or I think you get more explicit elitism where they basically just say like, no, we're sort of elitist and we're proud of it. And you get basically a version of like what the Tories used to be, who they just said like, no, we're the party of the upper classes, the landed gentry, and you just get some like modern version of that.
I mean, look, it's a free country. If somebody wants to run on that platform of I'm an elitist and I know better than you and just trust me,
And
and
I mean, it kind of worked for Trump, right? One of the things which people liked about Trump is like he
right.
never pretended
Yes. Yes.
he never made this like moralistic argument. He was so like upfront about his status. He rubbed it in everyone's face like, no, I'm so rich and never apologized for it. I think people found that more appealing than the sort of what Democrats did.
I think it would be an interesting approach. I think there's two figures. Obama, honestly, he's gone, right? He doesn't,
Yeah.
every once in a while, he sticks his head out and he says something. But I think the way that Obama is understood in the popular imagination at this point in his career, if he were to kind of embody that lane, I think that could come off as credible. And also remember Andrew Yang. Andrew Yang had all these people running around wearing hats that said math. And I think the subtext and in some places the plain text of the Andrew Yang theory of the case was about professionalism and expertise. And I don't know that he fully squared the circle in a way that was really overt the way that others have, but I think the Yang gang was sort of in that lane. I see it as a lane. I think it would be I as somebody who is very much opposed to that type of
Yeah,
governance.
I mean,
That
me too.
yeah, it would be I like I appreciate that within an open and robust primary process,
Yeah.
having people who exemplify the exact kind of politics that I oppose is really valuable because they can be a foil, they can be dunked on, they can be exposed, right, to strengthen the kind of politics and the lane and the platform, the candidates that I think actually really have it. And that said, I do think there's a very important lesson for Democrats, and I'll let you go in a minute, but I think there's a very important lesson for Democrats to look at what happened in the 2024 election. RFK Jr. first tries to run as a Democrat. The party rightly says, fuck you, no. Now,
Yeah.
now, in fairness, the party also said "fuck you, no" to Dean Phillips and to a bunch of other
Yeah.
people. Right? It wasn't just right. That was a fucked up instinct that they had. That was around protecting Bidenism. That was a poor choice across the board. But they did say "fuck you, no." So then he runs as an independent. Right? Gets all this momentum. He gets all the support. He attracts all these people, and then he throws in his lot behind Trump. And there are a lot of reasons why Trump beat Kamala, but I think one of the things that we tend to forget, and one of the things that we tend to talk about not nearly enough and not remember as significant as it may have been, is the role of Maha, the role of essentially an independent movement, bringing in non-voters, bringing in inconsistent voters, bringing in true swing voters, and then once they were all in behind RFK Jr., RFK Jr. saying, listen, we need you to vote for Trump, and I support Trump, and I endorse Trump, and we're in this together. Democrats can do that too. Democrats should do that too, whether it's Marianne Williamson, whether it's an Andrew Yang type, right? Whoever it is, there is a role to play in within Democratic Party politics for somebody to run outside the party or in an independent lane within the party primary and attract these independent voters and critical anti-system voters and the Maha voters, and then ultimately come around and endorse the nominee. That was a winning strategy for Trump. It could be a winning strategy for Democrats. And I think what you're talking about, JP, this idea of the like, I'm smarter than you. I know better. Look at all my degrees. Just trust me. Just give me your vote. Put me back in power, and we'll handle this. And you could just stay home and not worry about it and not do anything except vote for me for every 4 years. I think that isn't an attractive approach to some, but like fuck it, appeal to those people, and then go in and endorse
Yeah.
the more popular, whether it's right, Mark Cuban, whoever it is, and I think that's a worthwhile tack. A, so the left can dunk on it, but B, so people who actually like that kind of politics can be brought into the Democratic Party, because if they don't, they're going to go right back into the right.
Yeah, and I think also what's important is the Democrats, they just sort of need to actually have a debate about what they want to be. And I think one of the problems with the Democrats is that they've really relied on like emotional blackmail essentially as a political strategy, right? They've always said basically ever since Trump got on the scene, okay, you may not like what we stand for, but we can't have this debate now because we need to beat Trump. And if we don't beat Trump, all of these terrible things will happen, right? All of these bad things will happen. And that means that there has never really been a debate about like the actual content. And what I do think what the Democrats need is if they want to maintain what they're doing, if they want to keep the types of people who are in power now in power, then have these people go out and say, okay, I want to be in power, and this is why I want to be in power, rather than say, okay, I can't really articulate why I should be in power, but you need to vote for me anyway, because if Trump wins, he will do these terrible things to trans people. And it's just not sustainable because you are not having a debate about who actually deserves to have power and
Right.
why. You're not actually having a debate about the content. And I think one advantage is if people just got out and said, basically, I believe in divine right of kings and I'm the king and here's why, then you can basically say, okay, well, I think divine right of kings is bad, and you can make theological arguments and you can hash out. And I think that's something which Democrats have just been incredibly shy about. They're so conflict averse, and this conflict aversion just means that they haven't really figured out what they
Well,
want.
so you are wise beyond your years, but you're also a young man, because that is not a new thing. Let me tell you, Democrats have been doing that emotional blackmail for decades. And
Yeah.
pointing to the Republicans, this is long before Trump, to say they're worse, vote for us. A lot of establishment Democrats love Trump because it makes it easier to make that case when
Yeah.
you otherwise might not be able to hold that position and have it seem credible. I do want to push back on the assertion that this is a Democrats' problem because it's not a Democrats' problem. This is the crime of elite establishment, corrupt corporate Democrats against the rest of the party.
No, I don't mean the grassroots people who support the Democrats, but I think in terms of the elected officials and in terms of the political class,
Oh,
which
yeah.
is actually running the party, I do think that's a problem.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yes, you could not be more right. Well, it's been such a pleasure talking with you.
Yeah, it was great.
I
Wonderful.
love our conversations. I'm going to include a link to the series here when I put out this video. Again, folks who joined us live, thank you so much for being here. For
Thanks
folks
for
who
being
watched
here.
the video on replay, we really appreciate you coming in and checking it out. Again, I'm Evan Stern. I publish Certain Thoughts Substack. This is my good friend JP, publishes The Old Continent. It's been really good having you. Any final thoughts before we sign off?
Um, I think that I think that generally speaking, for everyone in politics, I think it's good to get engaged right now. Not not engaged to your partner, but engage yourself in politics, be active, because I think we live in a time where things are really changing really fast. And I think that if you have ideas about how society should work, about which direction we should go, and I think now is a good time to be active and get involved.
Amen. Second that.
Wonderful. Bye.
Talk to you soon.